you can hear me. So without further ado, I want to introduce our speakers. First, we have Rebecca Paulson, and Rebecca is a writer and artist who lives in Sitka, and her family is established in Sitka. And she serves on the Alaska Historical Board of Directors and is a member of the Alaska Historical Commission. And I've known Rebecca to be a dedicated researcher who delves into the deeper history of Sitka, such as in her research on Sheldon Jackson College. And she is passionate about historical education and uncovering a more authentic narrative. And so I'd like to welcome Rebecca in giving her presentation, Alexander Baranov, The Man, the Myth, Reality, Distortion, and Why It Matters. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you. Let's see. There we go. Is that working?
Yeah.
All right, excellent. So Alexander Baranov, the man, the myth. So who was Alexander Andreavich Baranov, and what was his role in Alaska's history? So even documents from his time were written from a certain perspectives, and his own writings were meant to put himself in a good light with his employers. Mostly the problem is that his 28-year career in Alaska was so filled with complex conflicts, and what led up to them and the motivations of the various parties are impossible to know. That said, thanks to the quantity and variety of recorded observations and the sound scholarship based on them, we do have a good general idea of the man and his life in Alaska. He came out to Alaska in 1790 at age 44 to work as a manager for the Golikov-Shelikov Fur Trading Company. And this was at the end of the first era of Russian colonization, which was unregulated, violent exploitation, primarily of the Aleutian Islands by multiple independent fur companies. By the time Baranov came out, the Russians relied on the forced labor of Onongan and Sukpiak men who hunted sea mammals from bidarkas or kayaks, and only a few companies were left. The company's leader, Grigory Shelikov, had a vision of permanent colonization of North America as a new Russia. In 1799, the company consolidated with the few remaining as the Russian-American Company, with a monopoly on trade and authorization to colonize North America on behalf of the Russian government. This company was based on Kodiak Island. In the 1790s, Baranov's projects included to consolidate control of Prince William Sound and Cook Inlet, build some ships, and send out fleets of native hunters for sea otters. This period was full of conflict, which included struggles with a competing company and with native people on the mainland, but also amongst those associated with the company, between and among leadership and employees, both native and Russian, with clergy and Russian naval officers sent out to assist the enterprise. Shipwrecks were constant, which caused deaths directly and through starvation and scurvy. In 1796, Baranov started a fur hunting base and agricultural colony at Yakutat, but his main goal was to claim the North American coast down to Nootka on Vancouver Island. And behind this effort was to sustain profit. They were running out of sea otter in Western Alaska. In the later 1790s, he sent fleets of hunters into Southeastern Alaska, returning with thousands of pelts. And it's important to remember that North America was entirely owned and defended by indigenous groups, and Southeast Alaska was Tlingit America. The maritime fur trade was then at its height, and Sitka was a popular port. These maritime traders joined in the pre-existing Northwest Coast indigenous trade. In 1799, Baranov negotiated for a site for a fur hunting base at Gajahin, north of Sitka, from the Kikseti leader Shkohukiek. In 1802, this fort was destroyed, most of the hunters killed at a different place at Kuyuv. In 1804, Baranov and some 800 of the Russians' native hunters plus other employees met in Sitka with the Russian frigate Neva. The Kikseti had built a fort at the mouth of Kazdahin, or Indian River. They had lost a canoe of gunpowder in a firefight between the canoe and a boat from the Neva. The Kiksadi evacuated that port. Then the following year made peace with the Russians and ceded them the site of Sitka. From then until 1867, the Russians maintained a colony at Sitka, which grew to about 800 residents, and from 1808 was the Russian-American Company headquarters. However, the Russians were never able to control the region and relied on maintaining relations with Tlingit leaders. Alexander Baranov was chief manager of the company at Sitka until he was relieved from duty in 1818 and died at sea on his way back to Russia. From the historical documents and scholarship, you could see that Baranov completely identified with his employer's goals, profit and empire, and he was absolutely focused in their pursuit, not sparing himself or anyone else. He does not seem to have been the kind of leader who took care of his people, reflected in the plots against his life and other rebellions, but instead one who led with force and charisma. Chaotic confrontations in 1814 between Baranov, American and British traders, and a Russian Navy commander hint that even later in life, he was less diplomatic than most people. His achievement was to colonize and hold Alaska against other European nations and to bring in profit to the company, but at a very high cost in lives. And the colonies turned out to be expensive to maintain and impossible to defend, and were transferred to the United States in 1867. While he was certainly an unusual person, the myth had to be created. So the seeds of the myth started early on with Baranov himself in letters to or that he knew would be read by his superiors, defending himself against accusations of cruelty to the native people and blaming others for the many, many conflicts and adverse events. One example was after 115 hunters on their way back to Kodiak from Sitka in 1799 died after eating PSB tainted mussels. He claimed in a letter that they had had plenty of provisions with them for a journey of hundreds of miles. This is hard to believe. And so had no need to be eating the mussels, making it seem like it was their own fault. His first biographer, Karol Klebnikov, was a longtime employee of the company and met Baranov at the end of his career and did his part to establish the myth of Baranov as a noble character who overcame great odds, including opposition, giving a positive spin on events, laying the blame for everyone on someone else other than Baranov. One example was Baranov's disastrous assault on the Tlingit fort in 1804. In Klebnikov's account, the failure was the fault of everyone but Baranov. Now, the company's profits, its very existence, relied on forced labor by Alaska Native men hunting sea mammals. Scores of hunters died on the expeditions, and the operation resulted in extreme hardship and starvation for those left at home, some of whom were also compelled to work for the benefit of the company. The spiritual mission that arrived at Kodiak in 1794 took the part of these people in a prolonged conflict between them, employees, a naval officer against Baranov and his top assistants. In 1800, some of the Kodiak villages refused to go on that year's hunt. Baranov and his people put it down ruthlessly, threatening to beat or kill those who refused. That the company relied on forced labor, that this took an enormous toll on the native population of Kodiak and other places, and that Baranov was ruthless in crushing rebellion are an inconvenient and yet fundamental aspect of his career that sympathetic biographers smoothed over, justified, or ignored, and still do in at least 2 biographies that were published this century. So according to Klebnikov, Baranov, quote, took wise and decisive action to put down the mutiny, which would have spread and led to the loss of, quote, everything they had achieved. So the myth of Baranov was elaborated in H.H. Bancroft's History of Alaska, published in 1886. At every point, Baranov is shown to be in the right, bold and wise. The accusations of mistreatment of native people and of his Russian workers are dismissed as, quote, unfounded or, quote, exaggerated. They assert that Russian people respected his bravery. Most of the section on the Russian period was written by Ivan Petrov, a remarkable translator and writer, but also, as noted in a 1968 article by Russian American scholar Richard Pierce, a serial fabricator. Pierce says that Petrov generally stayed close to the Russian sources, but did include a completely fabricated journal of a Russian Orthodox missionary, Father Juvenal. Most of the account of Baranov's activities follows Khlebnikov and the official history of the Russian-American Company by P.A. Tikmanov, but the most vivid scenes are new. Father Juvenal described Baranov joining and singing hymns, quote, in the same hoarse voice with which he was shouting obscene songs the night before, when I saw him in the midst of a drunken carousal with a woman seated in his lap. And at the end, with a passage from Washington Irving's History Astoria, from the American trader who was involved in and partly instigated the chaotic events at Sitka in 1814, taking his drinking and his irascibility to a heroic scale. Quote, if you do not drink raw rum and boiling punch as strong as sulfur, he will insult you as soon as he gets drunk, which will be very shortly after sitting down to table. Bancroft's history was the main reference for Alaska's Russian history for some 90 years. When Limestone Press and others started publishing translations of documents from the Russian era. Bancroft's history was copied and freely embellished by later writers, further establishing the myth of Buranop. C.L. Andrews published his book Sitka in 1922, slightly revised it in 1944. It's aimed at the visitor to Sitka. While his portrayal of Baranov is clearly based on Bancroft's, he adds incidents and detail that do not seem to have any basis in anything but his own imagination. These are focused on the relationship of Tlingit people to Baranov. Andrews exaggerates the hostility of these, quote, strange, warlike, shrewd people, and portrays Baranov and later Russians as staying at Sitka only with their superior ability. Quote, the Tlingits who howled at Sitka's gates were utterly without conscience. Some of them came nearly every day to search for some unguarded and accessible means of attack, but Baranov was never off his guard. Quote, the Tlingits who slunk down through the tall spruce timber that surrounded the stockade hated him, but they feared and respected him. They felt he had superhuman power. They never caught him napping. They had destroyed old Sitka and butchered the people. They came to his portcullis gates and asked to come in. Baranov looked at them with level eyes. He showed them his defenses and, quote, not one of them dared to plot an attack while Baranov ruled at Sitka. So this portrayal is an important change from the previous accounts. In fact, the Russians never had enough force to not have to carefully maintain diplomatic and trade relations with Tlingit leaders. This relationship is clear in the letters of the Russian-American Company at Sitka, published as A Construction History of Sitka, Alaska, as documented in the records of the Russian-American Company. So this is an important part of the myth, that Baranov was so superior to the hostile native people that he could hold them off with a much smaller force. And this is a very important part, that the Tlingit were fierce, powerful, a worthy adversary. Andrews also enlarges the difference between the Russians and the Tlingit people. In Russian documents, indigenous people are portrayed in their relationship to the goals of the company as workers or as hostile and obstacles to expansion. But in order to get anything done, Baranov and others on the ground must have had to understand their adversaries' motivations and goals. In Andrews' portrayal, however, Tlingit people are reduced to a cartoon. Sometimes the, quote, savagery in their blood would boil, although the, quote, Aleut native people were, quote, gentle and indolent, another stereotype. While not directly to do with Baranov, Andrews paints a picture of the success of Russian occupation at Sitka that survives to this day. Russian Captain Fyodor Litki described Russian Sitka in the late 1820s in detail, describing the hospitality of the governor, the gardens, the food, and workshops, but also told about the precarious nature of supply for the colony and the shortage of manpower. Andrews leaves that part out, giving the impression that Russian Sitka was better off than it was. He elaborates on the grand social life in the castle and quotes a ghost story from travel writer Eliza Sidmore. Sidmore, in her Alaska, its southern coast and the Sitkan archipelago, published in 1885, also used Litki and also exaggerated his portrayal of Sitka's prosperity. From Litki's saying that the Sitka foundry cast some bells for California, she enlarges to, quote, The bells of half the California mission churches were cast at the Sitka foundry, and tells of the courtly life in the castle. Littke also tells how firearms were a popular item of trade by the Russians to the Tlingit at this time, which also doesn't fit the myth, was also left out. Travel writers and tourism promoters brought the myth to a polish, none more than Barrett Willoughby in her Sitka, Portal to Romance, published in 1930. Here, from his stockaded log castle on the Kikor, Alexander Baranov, daredevil little iron governor of the fur colonies, once ruled the North Pacific and spun a web of power and commerce that reached to every corner of the world. Quote, death lurked every moment outside the stockade where hordes of murderous Tlingits prowled, watching for any slackening of vigilance on the part of the Russian sentinels. But within that new world castle flowed wine of regal vintage. Silks and velvets billowed in the candlelight. Jeweled swords and gold-laced uniforms glittered, while the merry company, scorning danger, danced their minuets to the tinkling music of the clavichord. And we can't talk about the myth of Baranov without mentioning Hector Chavigny and his Lord of Alaska, published in 1942. It's fantasy and elaborates the myth of Baranov as the Western action hero, fighting his inferiors, bad priests, resentful officers, as well as the natives, his faults, the heroic ones of drinking hard and of having a common law wife. Chavigny freely invents incidents and dialogue. The myth of Baranov is that he was a hero conquering dangerous native people in spite of the obstacles of the many inferior people he had to deal with, from debauched Promyshleniki to meddling priests. The essential elements include the savagery, hostility, and strength of the Tlingit people, Baranov's ability to subdue them with his superior courage and intelligence, and the glory and romance of the castle and the industry and sophistication of Russian Sitka. How does this myth survive today? I see it continuing in two main strands. One is the notion of essential difference between European and indigenous people. The notion that native people were mysterious and savage survives in the notion now that the Tlingit are in harmony with nature. And so we're vulnerable to the Western style exploitation of resources. It was a culture clash, and that their culture thrived due to abundant natural resources rather than from technology and hard work, the extension of the myth of native people as, quote, indolent. The second strand related to the superiority of the European is the notion that Buranop and the Russians absolutely conquered the Tlingit and that they held all of what is now Alaska. So this myth departs from what is known today. Native culture is as sophisticated as European culture. There is no inherent racial difference between groups of people, and certainly not a superior-inferior relationship. And the Russian hold on southeastern Alaska was weak. The US occupation in 1867 was much stronger than the Russians. Americans at the time held that belief that Native people were fundamentally different and inferior, the root of the racial bias that has harmed and impeded Native Alaskans to this day. So the irony is that with growing awareness of the impact of racial bias in the American era, the myth of Baranov is strengthened and even added on to. The strength of the United States government is mapped back in time onto the person of Baranov, who becomes a colonialist oppressor of the Tlingit. The Russians were oppressors of Native people in Western Alaska with their overwhelming force over many, many decades, but that's not so glamorous as supposedly conquering the, quote, warlike Tlingit. Secondly, the mechanism for the oppression is made out to be the inherent difference in sophistication between Europeans and indigenous people. Native people in this view suffer from contact with modern capitalist culture. So this narrative or myth is everywhere in Sitka, and signs in our parks and our museums, and even in an exhibit that's being planned for the Russian Bishop's House right now, and on websites. And it emerged in the 2020 debate over removal of the statue of Alexander Baranov from the center of town. One sign in Sitka tells how local Tlingit fished, hunted, gathered food, and traded salmon, seal oil, and herring eggs with other Native Americans. But this peaceful place was once at the heart of a fierce conflict. It goes on to say that Europeans and Russians came after sea otter and that the Russian-American company established outposts, leaving the impression that Tlingit trade with other Native people and food gathering was what was in conflict with the European trade in sea otter. It doesn't mention the substantial trade between Europeans and Americans and Tlingit leaders. On a website, the story of Tlingit people begins with how they relied on the ocean for their food and ends with, quote, in 1821, the Russians invited the Tlingit back to Sitka. They intended to profit from the Tlingit's hunting expertise, and more importantly, to put an end to the occasional Tlingit raiding. For the duration of Russian occupation, the Kikseti lived in the village, an area just outside the stockaded town. They supplied the colonists with furs and food, while the Russians introduced them to their culture through education and religion. But cannons were always trained on the village, and the Russian stockade was closely guarded. The 1804 Battle of Sitka was the end of open Tlingit resistance, but the Russians were safe only so long as they were vigilant. And this could have come straight out of Seal Andrews. On another sign at a different park, the cause of the Battle of 1802 is laid to clashing cultures. The RAC and the Tlingit held contrasting beliefs about land and resource ownership. As RAC employees settled here, tensions escalated between these disparate cultures, setting the stage for conflict. And in fairness, all this stuff dates from around 2012, 2013. In 2020, Sitkans debated the removal of a statue of Baranov in front of Sitka's Centennial Hall. The statue was a gift to the town by a local family. Just before its dedication in 1989, someone sawed the nose off. It was later repaired. The statue displaced the Tlingit canoe that was originally in front of the building in 1967. Many in Sitka saw the statue as inappropriate in such a prominent place because it does not reflect Sitka's history or identity and is offensive in ignoring Sitka's long Tlingit history. And it was removed and is now in the museum with the blessing of the family who donated it. So the myth of Baranov came up in statements by people wanting to keep the statue because Baranov brought civilization to the Native people. But some supporters of the removal also relied on the myth, stating that Baranov stayed through force against the will of Tlingit leaders and oppressing local people. So we went from being an epic hero to an epic villain, when what we really need is to put this fellow back into the context of the history and to bring the Tlingit history to the fore. It's hard to get away from a narrative we grew up with and accepted as fact. We need a new narrative based on historical scholarship that includes Tlingit history. Another part of the myth that hurts us today is the notion that Native people have no history. Bancroft wrote, "What a land of this, of which to write a history, bleak, swampy, fog-begirt, and almost untenanted, except by savages, can a country without a people furnish material for a history." We all need to question the language, concepts, and assumptions we use. We need a new narrative that does not glorify the mythical conquering European. Let's see. Here we go.
Thank you, Rebecca. So we'll
Thanks.
be taking questions at the end for both of the presenters. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce Nico Sanguinetti, and I can hear you all now. I'm glad I can. Okay. So Nico Sanguinetti is the curator of collections and exhibits at the Juneau Douglas Museum in Juneau, the Juneau Douglas City Museum, sorry. She is mainly responsible for the creation, development, installation, and deinstallation of museum exhibits, as well as the care and maintenance of the museum collections, including the Oc and Wushkatine totem poles that she will be speaking about. I've known Nico to be a thoughtful facilitator of projects with various Indigenous and other Alaska groups and an advocate for space for marginalized groups to narrate from their own historical truths. I asked Niko what drew her to this project, and she said that, you know, basically, as part of her job, they are re-raising the Wishkatine pole, but also she wanted to dig deeper and think more critically about the meaning behind these two poles and what led to their creation. So thank you, Niko, and welcome, and we're glad to hear your presentation too.
Thank you, Anastasia. Let me just share my screen. Oh. There we go. If I could just get confirmation that everyone can see it.
Yep.
Thank you. Thank you very much. As Anastasia mentioned, I'm Nico Sanguinetti. I would like to start my presentation today by acknowledging that I'm giving this presentation on Tlingit Ani, the ancestral and traditional homeland of the Aquan and the Takuquan, and that we pay respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. So I'm Nico Sanguinetti. I'm the curator of collections and exhibits at the Juneau Douglas City Museum. And today I'm going to be presenting Centennial Delusion, the carving of the Juneau Centennial Totem Poles, which happened in 1980. And we're going to be looking into the preconceived notions that were held by the Centennial Committee, how they effectively addressed them, and how the myth and mystery of the iconographies of these totem poles continues today. So we're going to go back, not quite to the beginning, but to the earlier days of the city we know today as Juneau. And in 1880, Kaua'e led the prospectors Joseph Juneau and Richard Harris to Gold Creek and what is Zanti Kahini. And the amount of gold that they found there led to them staking a town site that year that would grow in the next year to have over 100 settlers that would rapidly grow into the Juneau that we know now. Fast forward 100 years later, 1980 is approaching, and the residents of Juneau are wanting to celebrate the centennial of our city. And I'll point out that by this point, Juneau and Douglas are merged together, and we are the city and borough of Juneau. So even though everything says Juneau Centennial Committee, we are including Douglas in this plan. So the city and borough of Juneau's assembly passed a resolution in 1977 to form a Centennial Committee that would be focused on celebrating the centennial in 1980 through a variety of propositions. And when that resolution was passed, obviously they weren't 100% sure what they were going to do, but they really had a grand plan for the year of 1980. They wanted to have a year of celebrations, and that included artistic endeavors, public artworks, theater productions, even the rebuilding of the log cabin church. From the get-go, they were very ambitious about what they wanted to accomplish in that year. One of the big ideas that they had really from out of the gate was to have a totem pole. And it's expressed in some questionable language, things like, we want to have a totem pole that shows Tlinkits. In theory, it was a good idea. The way that it was presented is a bit problematic, which is something that we are striving to correct. We will admit that immediately with the plan to have a totem pole, instead of just deciding what they wanted to put on it, they immediately reached out to the Alaska Native community of Juneau. Jeff Morrison is one of the people who was on the Centennial Committee and immediately started reaching out to various organizations to see what that would entail. And we'll note that on that crest, the logo, that's the word, sorry, the logo of the Centennial Committee that's there on the right-hand side, it was important for the committee, and there are minutes in their meetings discussing this, but it was important for them to have eagle and raven. So even at the time, they were aware of the importance of the iconography here in Juneau. As I mentioned, Jeff Morrison immediately started outreach to the Indigenous community here in Juneau. He reached out to the Alaska Native Brotherhood, Alaska Native Sisterhood, Tlingit and Haida Central Council, Gold Belt Corporation, looks like it's the Alaska Corporation, as well as the Alaska State Museum and the University of Alaska of Juneau at the time, which we now know as University of Alaska Southeast. So immediately wanting to make sure that this idea was getting run by the proper people. He was immediately told that one totem pole to represent all of Aquan, which is the area that we live in here, was inappropriate. In Tlingit culture, there are two moieties. You have eagle and raven, at least here in Juneau. In other places, you will have eagle and wolf, but eagle/wolf. But here in Juneau, we have eagle and raven. And these are two moieties. You're born into one. It is the moiety of your mother. And then you marry into the other. And each moiety is meant to support and uplift the other. They are paired. And it is impossible to have two moieties on the same totem pole. So they should not and cannot exist on the same pole. And if you're going to highlight an area such as Aquan, you really do need to have two poles that are representing both eagle and raven. To the credit of the committee, they immediately accepted this fact and set about figuring out how they could accomplish carving two totem poles, one to represent eagle and one to represent raven. They had already acquired some funding through the committee as well as from the state, and they had some donations lined up. But they immediately set about figuring out how to accomplish this possibly monumental task. So I'll note that these were not carved at the same time. The Wishkitan pole did come first. However, for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to be talking about both of them together. So the eagle totem pole was to be called the Wishkitan totem pole, and the raven totem pole was originally called the Oc tribe pole. So these two boxes, you're going to have the original name up at the top, the modern name, and what is more the culturally acceptable name is we have Wishkitan on one side and Oc on the other. Wishkitan is eagle, Oc is raven. And both of these poles the plan was to be guided by elders in the community to make sure that the figures that were selected are culturally appropriate and representative of the area and the people of Aquan. For the Wishkitan pole, the guidance came in the form of George Jim Sr., who was an elder from Angoon. And for the Oc pole, we had Bessie Visaya, who was a elder here in Juneau from Plenedy. And so both George Jim and Bessie Visaya would be the ones guiding the selection of the figures that we're going to talk about here later on. We'll also note that everything that was decided by the Centennial Committee and then later on the Totem Pole Committee, they would form their own committee to separate from the larger committee to focus specifically on the issues that pertain to these two totem poles. They would send out updates to the community and to the organizations that they had spoken to previously. So ANB, ANS, Tlingit and Haida. Jeff Morrison made sure that most of the, as far as I can tell, all of the decisions that were made were public and transparent, which would lead to a lot of the changes and the updates that we're talking about here. So we really did start from this place of what I kind of call delusion with this idea, oh, we can represent all Alaska Native people in Juneau here on this one totem pole, to immediately going, well, that's not going to work. How can we fix this? And then set about actively fixing it. As I mentioned, the Wishkitan totem pole was planned before the Oc totem pole, but they would eventually be placed in the same place. So the design elements for the Wishkitan totem pole were chosen from a conversation with George Jim, and the figures themselves do not directly align with the story. And I have yet to be able to find that specific story. This presentation is almost a work in progress of a project that we've been working on for a couple of years now. And there are mentions that this conversation has been recorded, but I've yet to find it. So I'm still on the hunt for that. And then the Oc figures were chosen as directed by Bessie Bisaya. The same, it was told through a story. However, she was more adamant about pointing out specifically which icons she wanted to have included on that totem pole. So these lists of design elements would be sent out in the proposals to carvers as well as to the community at large to make sure that if there were any questions or problems about including these images on these totem poles, that the community would have a chance to respond, and that the Centennial Committee and the Totem Pole Committee would be able to address those concerns. And as a result, there were changes that were made that we're going to talk about here in just a second. So letters were sent out to Indigenous carvers throughout Alaska, letting them know that this project was happening and to ask for proposals. And as I mentioned, that list of design elements were included in those call for proposals, so all carvers had something to work with. They received 5 proposals, and the unanimous decision was to select Nathan Jackson as the carver for the Wishkitan totem pole. He would eventually be carving both of them, but as they were done in stages, it initially started with the Wishkitan totem pole without the assumption that he would then carve the second one. It's interesting, even Dr. Walter Soboleff wrote a letter to the committee endorsing Nathan Jackson and suggesting him to be the one to carve. And Nathan Jackson is a Tlingit from the Sockeye clan from Kilkutquan, and at the time of the Centennial was living in Ketchikan, where he continues to live today. And so he was selected as the main carver, and he was assisted by Steve Brown as well as his wife, Dorica Jackson. And Dorica actually did the majority of the painting on the totem poles. And Nathan likes to talk about how he and Steve really fell into this wonderful flow and how they were allowed to carve, or how they were able to carve together, where Steve would carve a lot of the figures of the body portions, which left Nathan the opportunity to focus more on the faces of the figures that we have on the totem poles. And in the end, both this team would end up carving both of the totem poles. The design of the Wishkitan totem pole wasn't thought to be a problem until a call was sent out for proposals. Ed Kuhn Sr., who was one of the people they reached out to as a possible carver and who did submit a proposal, immediately pointed out that some of the figures that George Jim Sr. had listed on there were actually property of Kagwantan and did not represent the Wishkitan people, and they did not have the right to use them. And this was backed up by a Kagwantan elder by the name of Charlie Joseph. And the committee immediately took steps to remedy that situation. And so out of the original list, the questionable design elements were halibut, eagle, and wolf. And in the end, the wolf was kept because the wolf was a house crest for Kagwantan, but the reason it was included in the Wishkitan totem pole was because of a separate story that relates to Wishkitan. So the meaning behind it allows it to be included according to George Jim and to Nathan. The remaining figures would also be slightly rearranged to better accommodate some of the stories and to provide better structure for the totem pole itself. You'll notice between the two, the Wishkitan totem pole does have a larger amount of images, and Nathan likes to joke that if George had been left to his own devices, there would have been 20 design elements on there, and he had to kind of scale it down a bit. So in order to keep some kind of structural integrity, there was a little bit of rearranging on where the figures would be located. The Oc Totem Pole had a lot less, had fewer changes made to it, with really only the seagull being removed and a slight rearrangement of the layout for pretty much the same reasons, to provide better structural integrity to the totem pole. And I did touch on it a little bit before, but when you're picking these design elements, and this is part of the mystery that's been revealed through this project, is the ownership of some of these images and what they represent and how they're portrayed and how they're tied into their neighboring figures helps determine whether or not they should be allowed to be on that pole. And especially with that, the question of the wolf and the fact that it couldn't be used to represent a house crest because that was not appropriate for Aquan Wishkitan, but because it ties into a Wishkitan story that is heavily influential in their oral history, it could be included. And these are the types of understandings that we're still trying to tease out today. There was some back and forth between the totem pole committee on the size of the final totem poles. Once it was decided that there were going to be two, they were struggling to figure out how that would be possible. Originally, Sea Alaska Corp and the Alaska Lumber and Pulp Corporation agreed to donate a 40-foot red cedar log from Wrangell. When it was decided that there would be two totem poles, the first suggestion would just be to cut that log in half, 2 20-foot totem poles. That would be acceptable. However, Sea Alaska came back and said, no, we'll donate 2, which is how we ended up with 2 40-foot totem poles representing the Juneau Centennial. And both of those totem poles were carved in the plaza area of the Sea Alaska Corporation building here in Juneau. That plaza is still there. People eat lunch. It's fantastic. It was carved in full view of the public, and there were some educational programs that were tied into it. It was tied into the whole Centennial schedule and was really part of the whole celebration. Again, with that attempt to be fully transparent, which is kind of an early example of this, looking back at the 1980s and working with Indigenous peoples and making sure that everything that was being decided was also in full view of the public for public commentary. We will note that there was some vandalism of the Wishkitan totem pole while it was being carved. The murrelet as well as the shark fin, which extends, were cut off and stolen. Nathan Jackson did end up fixing that, which is wonderful, but a bit unfortunate that that happened while it was out in public view. Both of the totem poles, the Wishkitan pole was carved in 1980 and the Oc Totem Pole was carved in 1981, and both were placed in front of Centennial Hall, which is our convention center here in Juneau, when the Centennial Hall was completed in 1983 with the dedication ceremony. And both were placed next to each other as is appropriate to have balance between eagle and raven. I'd like to speak briefly about the figures that are present on each of the totem poles, and especially regarding the myths and questions that have come up since they've entered the museum collection. And I'm going to be moving from the top down, as is appropriate when you're reading the story of the totem pole, as has been relayed to me from the speaker for Wishkitan, Aquan Wishkitan. So we're going to start with Uncle Sam, who has kind of a couple of translations, but really represents white man and his culture and the how it was presented to Alaska Natives, which resulted in citizenship. And depending on who you're asking, when you're asking, and to whom they are speaking, that can be a good thing or a bad thing, and also has several other interpretations. But it was apparently very important to George Jim to include Uncle Sam to represent the citizenship of Alaska Natives in the United States. But we do get a lot of questions about that specifically. The shark, the murrelet or auklet, the thunderbird and bear are all house crests. And this is part of the mystery, is that we don't actually know specifically which houses they represent. And because of differences in translation and the decimation of some of the local Indigenous groups, we're not 100% sure if we'll ever be able to figure that out. And because so much of the figures were taken from an oral story, where it's even noted by Jeff Morrison that they don't directly line up to images of the story itself, we're still working on figuring out if there are direct connections and if these represent specific houses or not. The wolf, as I mentioned, represents a Wishkitan story about how an injured wolf went to a Wishkitan hunter because it was suffering from a bone in his mouth. The hunter helped him by removing it, and the wolf claimed all Wishkitan as part of his family and would bring them luck. And that's the story that's reflected through that image, not a house crest. The Gunaca date or sea bear is a house crest, interestingly enough, the next figure of the good luck woman is an Aquan raven story. And this is another one of those mysteries where traditionally you wouldn't have anything representing the other moiety on your totem pole. So eagle shouldn't have anything that's raven on there. So there are some notices of people being upset by this, and with them pointing out that that's a raven story, how can it be on an eagle totem pole? However, we've heard the opposite argument in that it's honoring their counterpart, their raven counterpart, by reflecting their story. And for the speakers for Aquan, Raven and Eagle today, Fran Houston and Leimomi Martin, both of them seem to be quite happy with that inclusion and the connection between the two sides of Aquan. The next is a spirit man, which represents 5 powerful spirit men who belong to the Wishkitan village in Berners Bay, which is the area just north of Juneau. And the halibut head on his chest is meant to symbolize strength. If you'll notice, the halibut was one of the house crests that wasn't able to be included because it didn't belong to Wishkitan, but the strength and the symbolism of the halibut is still included through the inclusion of that small piece of the spirit man. And at the very bottom, you've got Berners Bay Mountain, which represents the ancestral home of the Aquan Wishkitan. And we're still trying to figure out all of the stories from this totem pole, and it's going to be an ongoing mission. And when I say we, I mean really the speakers for Aquan, both Eagle and Raven, who have been working to raise this Wishkitan pole, which I'll touch on a little bit later. The Oc Totem Pole has a few less images on it, but are no less powerful. It starts at the top with the raven, which represents the moiety that it represents. Next, you're going to have these number of rings, which represent the number of kuiks or potlatches that have been given by the raven Oc from Aquan, which the amount of rings and the number of kuiks given helps signify the wealth of the Aquan people. Next, you're going to have the Dipper, which is the Big Dipper, which represents the Yaktahit, which is the Big Dipper house. It's the house crest of the one of the houses that is here in Juneau, one of the Tlenedi. Below that, you have a frog or frog monster, which relates to a Yaktahit story about how they got their name when a frog monster claimed them as one of their own and claimed them as the Dipper house. Below that, you have a dog salmon, which is the house crest for the Tealhit, the dog salmon house, also a house within the Tlenedi. Below that, you have the summer weasel, and it's simply listed as a house crest, and one of those mysteries. This totem pole has a few less mysteries than the Wishkitan pole. It's a little bit clearer about where they specifically tie in, but the summer weasel remains a mystery as to which house it represents, and we're still looking into that. At the very bottom is the good luck woman, or the lucky woman, which, as I mentioned, is that Aquan raven story, which they share with the Wishkitan pole. Sorry. So where are they today, and why are they still important to us? This is partially why we've been asking these questions and why we have come to delve so deeply into the meaning behind these totem poles. They've been in our collection since 1980. However, we have kind of basic explanations for the meaning behind each of the images and the story behind the raising of the totem poles themselves. And they have been outside the entire time, well, until 2003, 2016, they've been outside. So they never were meant to be indoor pieces of art, but it's something that we are trying to figure out, as are many other museums, which is a whole nother discussion for another day. The Aquan, or the Oc Totem Pole, is conservation work was done in 2000 by Nathan and Dorica Jackson. While it was still outside Centennial Hall, it was cleaned and repainted. However, it was taken down in 2003 due to structural instability. In front of Centennial Hall is quite open to the elements. It's nearly on the waterfront. It is open to the Taku winds. Totem poles were never designed to last forever. They have a lifespan. They're meant to live and to die. However, when totem poles have been added to museum collections, that creates a bit of a conundrum for us, because when items are added to a museum collection, it's with the understanding that we're going to protect it in perpetuity. However, when you have objects that are meant to live and die, how do you work within that cultural framework, which is something I think museums are still struggling to do. The solution for my predecessors was that in 2003, when the totem pole came down, it was cleaned, it was repainted, and then was re-erected in the Juneau Douglas High School atrium. They actually built the stairwell around the totem pole, so it is not going anywhere. But it is inside, it's in a relatively stable environment, and under those environmental conditions, it can last for quite a long time. And it remains a part of JDHS and remains a part of the City Museum's permanent collection. The Wishkitan totem pole, which is really the catalyst for this entire talk and for all of this research, was that it was taken down in 2016, so it remained in front of Centennial Hall for a few years longer, which actually caused a bit of a stir in the Alaska Native community here in Juneau, because the two are meant to be together and they're meant to provide balance. When the Raven pole, the Oc pole, went down in 2003 and was re-erected in the high school, now both of them are unbalanced. And there were questions about if something would be re-raised in the same spot as the Oc pole to pair with the Wishkitan pole. However, that never happened, but the Wishkitan pole did submit to the same environmental conditions that the Oc pole did in 2016 when it needed to be taken down. It was stored in an off-site storage facility, and the search immediately began on where to put a 40-foot totem pole. As I'm sure anyone can imagine, it is not easy to find a building that is 40 feet tall that will allow a totem pole to stand upright in. Not only that, but to allow a 40-foot totem pole to go in through doors and then stand straight up. It was kept in a building in a warehouse. We moved it across town in 2019. But the silver lining to this story and the hope that I bring to this conversation is that we are hoping to re-raise it in the state office building in Juneau next month, November of 2021. Fingers crossed. Because we were planning on re-raising it, we were starting to work with the Indigenous community here in town, especially the speakers for Aquan, both Eagle and Raven side. And specifically with the Aquan Wishkitan, trying to figure out the stories behind all the different images on here, because we just didn't know. And it's led to a huge amount of discussions and deep diving into the research and reaching out to the various families to see who might have some idea, and has brought a lot of people together and has been the catalyst for all of this research, which is not done yet. The totem pole, when it gets re-raised in the state office building, will remain a part of our City Museum permanent collection and will be joining the Wasco pole, which is a Haida pole also in the atrium. So I just leave you with a couple of fun images of Nathan and Dorica Jackson taking a look at this totem pole, and me being very overwhelmed my first week on the job here. So we've been working on this for about 3 years now, and it never ceases to be slightly overwhelming, but always very exciting. So thank you all for listening. I will stop sharing my screen just now.
Great. Thanks. We look forward to having the poll go up. And now I'd like to open things up for questions of either of the presenters, Rebecca or Niko.
Anastasia, I can't hear you.
Yep, go ahead.
Can other people hear her?
You can't hear me?
No, we can't hear you. You're very muted. You're very quiet. Can you turn up the volume?
No, how can you hear me now? I'm
Yes.
just going to change it. I'm going through my camera.
Okay, we
All
can.
right. It's just a bizarre day. It's almost Halloween, I guess. So anyway, I was saying that thank you. We look forward to seeing the poll go up in the state office building, and it would be interesting to see how that gets in there and, you know, how you angle it up. We'd like to now open up for questions from all of you, and I see there's one in the chat already. So we'll just take them as they come, Rebecca and Niko, okay? So, and there are a few comments about your presentation, Rebecca, in the chat that you might want to take a look at. So the first question is, was Nathan Jackson Walter Sobolov's nephew?
I am not 100% sure, but I don't think so, no.
Okay.
And
Nathan.
Anastasia, there is a question in the question and answer panel, which is separate, so I'll read that. It's from David Ramser to Rebecca.
Okay.
Are there useful documents anywhere, like in Russian archives, to provide a more realistic portrayal of Baranov, or have they been whitewashed too? Or Buranop, I mispronounced it.
Yeah, no, there's I think that the documents are, they are what they are, and they're really super useful. And there's, tons of people who are up here and and recording their experiences and what they saw. And, so that's not a problem. And just recently, Andreavich has published like 2 volumes, and there's going to be a 3rd volume like any day now, called Russian Colonization of Alaska. And they're real, I can't recommend it highly enough, but they seem to be very, he does seem to have a little bit of a soft spot for Baranov, but he doesn't stint on any of the actual, the reality of what was going on. And they're compact and really useful. Yeah.
Okay, so here's another question for Rebecca. First, thanks for your talk. This is from Michael Kramer. It was excellent. I was curious about RAC narratives on Baranov that were negative. I know the former Governor Rangel implicitly critiqued Baranov in 1839, and that the 1821 reorganization was related to negative impressions of Baranov's rule. Did any of those RAC narratives filter down into popular narratives on Baranov?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. No, and that's the thing. He was, I don't know, just kind of just that kind of outlaw type of a personality. I think that was part of what made him so, like bigger than life. And the popular narrative was, the fact that, these prim, members of the nobility who followed him did not approve. So yeah, no, it's totally part of the narrative, the popular narrative.
Okay, so Chris wants to know, Becca, is cutting the nose off of the Baranov statue part of a local tradition of shaming?
I have no idea, but apparently they tried to cut off his whole head, but they couldn't, and so went for the nose. Yeah.
Okay, Tom Kizia says, can you smell the name of the author? Sorry, can you spell? Can you spell the name of the author of the Russian colonization of Alaska volumes? Are these books based in part on Russian documents that weren't available 20 years ago? Sorry for that, Tom.
Yeah, no, he's Russian, and it's, yeah, and he has access to everything. Yeah, so he has access to things that we don't have access to. But yeah, it's outstanding.
And it's Andrei Grinev, is that who it is?
Grinev, yeah. I thought I typed it in, but maybe I didn't.
You typed it, it's going into the question and answer, which the panel
Oh,
necessarily see the answers. That's why we try to have everybody use the chat.
oh, okay.
Yeah, but it's in the chat now, the
Now it's in
spelling.
the chat.
Yep. Thanks. Thanks, all of you. Okay, so I missed a question from David. So to Rebecca, are there useful documents anywhere, like in Russian archives?
I think I already
To-
asked that one.
Oh, did he? Did you ask that? I'm sorry.
I read that one.
Okay. Got to practice this. Okay. Any other questions? Thanks for all the questions.
There might be something in the chat here.
I'm looking.
No.
Well, do you want to answer that one again from David? No, I'm just kidding. Okay.
Yeah. And I should
Maybe you
say
have a
too,
different
I
answer.
am not a Russian American scholar, and but fortunately trying to find ways that the record was distorted in popular culture is pretty easy to do.
Okay, and then, yeah, so there's a little discussion about Andre's last name and that it has some transliteration issues. So perhaps you can find it under a different spelling. But
Yeah, on the book it's Grinev and it has a 2 dots over the E, but
well, it will be interesting to see the developments that each of you mentioned in your presentations. It'll be interesting to see the developments around the statue of Baranov. And I think it's probably there are people who are thinking it's great that we are digging deeper into history and more broadly into historical narratives that make up our histories. So we have a fuller and more representative picture. And I want to thank you both for your presentations. And if there are any last questions, please speak up now, or we'll end the session. Okay, thank you so much for well done presentations and great questions.
And before everybody leaves, there's just a little bit of housekeeping that I apologize for the problems today with the logging in, and that you have to, you get to the registration page and you have to retype in stuff. And I don't know why that's happening, but I'm hoping that once you've done it today, that tomorrow it's not going to happen again. I think I know why it's happening and I don't know how to fix it. So just be patient and tell your friends and other people who have registered that might be what happens. And hopefully we go smoothly tomorrow, and we may do the same thing, that you get logged on in the morning, just stay on and leave your computer and walk away and do something else instead of re-logging in for each session, but we'll see how it goes. So thanks everybody for your patience, and I think we'll see everybody tomorrow. The session starts at 10 a.m. Out South Central Alaska. And again, I'll have the webinar open by 9:30 so people can start getting in. And I actually might even open it at 9:15, a little bit earlier. So if people have login problems, there's some time to figure that out so people don't miss things. But again, this is all being recorded, which I should have just turned off.